Artwork, critiques, Photoshop files, and reference sheets are all available on my Patreon. Well, hello there guys and girls, I hope you're doing bloody well. My name's Mikey and welcome back to my computer for a basics tutorial. So today we're going to be covering some of the common basic setup questions that are usually asked when it comes to Photoshop. It might be a little bit dry, but it's also going to be very quick, and this is some very good information. Basically, in my opinion, these quick basics are things that you absolutely want to know first before you have a go at doing any digital art, and also because we're going to be doing some more Photoshop tutorials in the future on the channel thanks to all of your suggestions, although don't worry, all of that paper and pencil stuff is going nowhere. So in a nutshell, we're going to talk about the canvas size, i.e. how big the piece of paper is that you digitally work on, make sure that you've got access to my digital brush packs, and also a little bit on getting some clean lines. And bear in mind that this is just the Mikey way of doing things, it's not necessarily the best way, so if you happen to know something that I don't when it comes to Photoshop, get yourself in the comment section below. So the first thing for me whenever I do a piece of digital art is I like to make sure that I'm working on an A3 sheet of paper. This guy just over here, and basically you can see that it's also set at 300 pixels per inch. I've already got this open just here, and a good A3 sheet is 29.7 centimeters by 42 centimeters as well. And when it comes to working on a size like this, it's a size where my computer can basically still handle it whilst it's also a very large working space. And 300 dots per inch is really just telling us that we're going to fit in a relatively good amount of detail, basically just enough that we could blow things up a little bit to be as large as a poster, or just really reduce things to fit by half, and then you know you're working on the equivalent of A4. In fact, when it comes to paper sizes, there are a few other reasons why I love a bit of A3. Now, in Japan, when it comes to thinking about manga and other sorts of production, they have what they call a Japanese Industrial Standard B4. So bear in mind, this is nothing to do with B-sized envelopes that you get in Europe and America, but that is 25.7 centimeters by 36.4, and a lot of mangakars work to this size, knowing that their work's then going to be squeezed down a little bit smaller for publication. But that's a whole thing on its own. As far as my perspective is concerned, if I'm working on A3, scaling down to the JIS B4 or just scaling down to an actual A4 size of paper is always going to be far better and easier with your artwork than working too small and trying to scale things back up. Now again, 300 dpi is how I like things, but when it comes to a lot of professionals, they tend to work at maybe 350 dpi or even a little bit higher, depending on if they're working on print publications or massive promotional posters or other bits. But as a good default for starting off, A3 300 dpi. And in fact, what I tend to do just to keep my life easy is I have a preset file which is A3 with a little bit of paper texture in the background just so that it's easier on the eye and balances the levels a little bit more to work with, and I open this file every time instead of opening Photoshop just because it saves me a tiny bit of work and I've already got a layer available. Now that's nothing much, but I'll certainly make sure that this particular file is included with all of the tutorials reference packs on Patreon. And just to give you a bit of a visual representation of what I'm talking about with DPI or dots per inch, here are two copies of a piece of art that I've done a while ago. On the left, it's very low resolution, 50 DPI, and on the right, it's what I usually work to at 300. Now, basically that means because there's so much information stored in any 1 inch, there's loads of different colors and details, I could kind of blow this thing up and, as mentioned, make it into a print or a poster. And if we zoom right in, you've got all of the different textures of the rough brush strokes, you can still see all of the detail, the image still makes sense. Now, although they look very similar, if we were to zoom in on a lower DPI resolution image, you can start to see, oh, just look at that, it's blurred. The system doesn't know what's going on in all of that detail, so Photoshop is just kind of expanding and blurring everything out. It just hasn't quite got that depth and range, and personally it makes me want to throw up. So always worth bearing in mind, if you've got a low DPI image, it's probably going to take up less file space, but you're losing all of that sweet detail. And when we're talking about saving things for file, it is worth mentioning that if you were to go ahead and save as and then decide that you wanted to make this Photoshop file export itself as a JPEG, you might get something which is a fairly large file size because the JPEGs actually include a fair bit of metadata nonetheless. So if I wanted to make sure I had this image set up so that the file size was very small so that I could maybe put it on the internet quickly, actually I would go to export and then save for web, and then I get this other dialog box come up, and then I'd click save from here. And doing that would basically mean that the JPEG file itself is nothing but just the image. It's not got loads of extra info in there, and it's not going to be taking up extra space. However, although that suits me just fine for getting artwork done, if you're somebody who's making some very crisp overlays for, say, your streams or want to make much more graphic work, I do actually recommend File and then Save As, and you probably want to going to do something like going to a bitmap or saving as a PNG file. Because if you save something as a JPEG but unfortunately save it as a low quality JPEG instead of a high quality one, you can end up losing some of those sharp line edges in how the file saves the data. Now, when it comes to the brushes that you might be using to actually create your artwork, Photoshop has quite a large range already included, but what I've done is reduced mine to only the brushes I've actually found myself using. This is simply because I'm a fairly simple guy in nature, and although you can find a lot of excellent free brush packs out there, Google's going to be your friend, if you have too many, it's actually a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're just starting out and you want to get a feel for things. So I'm going to kind of talk about the brushes that I use and what they're useful for, but worth a really quick mention, although all of these pretty much come in Photoshop, there's a very good brush that I like to use here. I'm fairly new to it, but I'm having a lot of fun with it, and this brush is actually part of a pack from a different artist altogether, a gentleman called Dave Greco. So I will link to his YouTube page below, where you can download his entire brush pack for free. It's also really massive, but I don't want you guys thinking that this one's kind of one that I've made up for myself. So I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in a little bit and just let you know how I like to do things. The first one I have is a very soft airbrush. If we give this a cheeky right click, you can see basically that there's no hardness, and don't worry too much about the size. The way that I have this one set means that I can get a very soft line or a very heavy one depending on the amount of pressure that I've got going on. And when it comes to things like that, turning on or turning off the level of pressure that you might have affecting how opaque or how dark things are going to be can be done by this little brush palette toggle here. And then over here it's the transfer button, which tells us that a lighter stroke is going to be a bit softer and a harder stroke is going to be a bit more firm. You can turn it off here and here, but also equally you've got a guy just up here that does a similar job. Now I have this one preset to only be affecting the level of opacity when I change for pressure, but it does keep the size the same, and for me this is very useful for using as my first brush of the day when it comes to a bit of artwork, for working out what kind of very basic building blocks that I'm going to be using to build up a character, for example, and then doing things on another layer. And again, if this is kind of your absolute first introduction to Photoshop, your layers area is over here. You can always just add a new one by popping a little click onto this guy down there, just so that any lines I do here don't really affect the lines below it. I can still delete those and these guys are safe. So I'll just delete these scribbles very quickly, pop a new layer on, and let's look at the second brush along. This one is pretty much the opposite of the first. This one is a very sharp lined brush, and as you can see it's got 100% hardness, ladies, and again don't worry about the size, you can go up or go down depending on the level of work or detail that you're trying to put into something. Now this brush is set so that it's always really dark, it's not going to be soft or see-through, so instead the level of pressure I apply is going to affect how thick that line is. A lot of pressure, it's very heavy, a little pressure, it's very thin. And again I can pop into this toggle box here, and that is called Shape Dynamics. If I turn it off, it's a big fat line, and if I pop it on, we've got some sharper edges. But where I really like to go is up here, toggling this guy on and off if I want to change that effect. But I like to have it preset so that we've got things good to go from these first two brushes. The third brush along is one that I tend to use only for shadows and highlights to drawing hair these days. It's a half and half, where basically it's about 54% hard. I don't know why that puts a smile on my face every time I say it. And as you can see, the opacity is affected by the amount of pressure, but also the width or the size of a brush. So now if I just work very lightly, it's thin and also quite see-through. And if I work with a lot of pressure, it gets thicker and darker. So I'm going to delete that layer again just for the space, make a new one to work on again. Oh, and by the way, when we've got this lovely paper texture in the background, which really just helps me kind of feel a bit more happy, even if I'm doing bad sketches in Photoshop, never work directly on it. Always make sure you're working on a fresh layer. That's just some general advice. The next brush along is my main texture brush, which is one that I've really started getting to grips with when painting out my art pieces instead of just doing that cleaner anime technique like this. And if I turn off the pressure for size and keep things fairly simple, you can see that there's this little element of grain that we're getting to things here, which is quite nice. And also it's very good for kind of getting some texture, even if you're trying to blend between two colors. So I'm going to take this brush and make it a little bit bigger, just to give you an example. I'm going to rotate it just a little bit to flatten it out for where I want to do some brush strokes here. And I'm going to grab another tone. Let's go into some blue about here. And I'll just very, very quickly talk about blending things together. Now, if you were to hold Alt, your brush turns into an eyedropper tool, which basically picks the color. So if I'm on this purple and I want to start coloring in purple again instead of blue, I can just tap Alt, get that purple out, and we're back to the purple color. And so the way I tend to blend two colors together is to kind of get a load of brush strokes in so that these two colors together, and then with some slightly lighter strokes start to merge the two. If I put a bit of blue over the purple, I get a bit of turquoisey, wait, that's absolutely wrong. I get a bit of this kind of bluish purple color in the middle where I can dive in, pick that middle color now, and then start to use those strokes to kind of blend out in both directions. Over here, I'm just going to pick out another color, keep blending in, and you keep blending and just tapping that Alt button to pick up the colors that you're currently working on until you reach a point where things are kind of smoothed between the two color tones and you've got a blend that makes you relatively happy. It's a very basic thing, but that's something that you're generally going to be doing quite a lot if you're going to be painting things in Photoshop, so good to get under your wing. Next brush along from that is just a basic square brush. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and I tend to use this for making really small thumbnails of stuff where I just want to work very roughly and map out various shapes. I just quite like that it's got a super sharp edge to work with and it's very blocky, so that I know if I actually start a piece of work with a brush like this trying to get a feel for something, I'm never going to end up doing anything in high detail, and that forces my mind's eye to make sure that I'm working in a kind of larger concept for a piece before I actually drop in and start to get really fine and really pernickety. So I just find oddly that a brush like this helps kind of keep me pushed back and working at a larger scale when just starting out or roughing out the ideas of a piece. But again, I think that's just a weird personal preference. And then lastly, if I just make a bit more space down here, the final brush is the DGA brush, and this one is a little bit more squarish but also has a very nice texture to it. Where our texture brush is a little bit rougher, this one kind of has a certain pastel quality to it where you can see immediately the grain. Even if you're doing very light strokes, you can actually just apply the pressure a little bit harder and get an absolute solid color, which makes it quite a versatile brush for trying to get bitty details or just filling in a particular area. And when it kind of works with other bits, that grain does help just keep your blend a little bit more alive if you're trying to work on an image where you've got just those hints of texture, maybe a bit of skin that's working from light to shadow, etc. So quite a nice brush, but also one that I'm fairly new to, so I'm not using it too much just yet. Now again, you're going to be able to find in Photoshop all sorts of amazing brushes which simulate clouds and grass and all sorts of other shapes, and really you just want to dive in, play around and have as much fun with it as possible. But if you want to kind of get cracking, these are the basic starting steps I tend to recommend. So again, I'm going to make sure that all of that is available for you guys, either in links below and also another copy in the tutorials work pack that is on Patreon. But I just want to quickly address another question you guys tend to ask me a lot about, and that is, how do you get nice, clean lines? And I'm going to be honest, personally for me, there's no easy answer to that one. There's no quick method. Now, you've probably heard of things like, say, Lazy Nizumi and other software programs which take your lines and automatically make your lines a little bit sharper and straighter if yours are just a little bit wobbly, or kind of just neaten things up for you. I don't have a problem with that, but personally, I don't like using that kind of thing because I think I just want my own art to be mine, and I want to kind of make ownership of these kind of sharper lines part of my own journey. But that's just me being weird. Don't let stuff get in the way. Lazy Nizumi apparently is also quite good for using some perspective tools to get some nice building block lines for your structures and your background, so it probably is worth a look. So the way I personally tend to get some nice clean lines is usually one of two methods. I'm just going to get rid of those guys, get a fresh layer up. Now imagine that I'm kind of trying to get into a piece. I'm starting off with my very soft brush, and all we're going to do is kind of get a very rough head shape. I'm not going to do any details in this example, but when mapping out that kind of softer stage with this softer brush, the nature of this soft brush does mean that I'm not going to lock down any high detail straight away. It forces me just to kind of focus on the overall shapes and forms and compositions of something before we really smash into the details. So don't worry about that. But when I go on to, say, a layer above, what I can do is try to use the sharp line tool over here, the next brush. Let's make that relatively black. And when it comes to this one, this doesn't forgive you for using lots of small strokes making your way around. You end up with these very, very messy lines. So let's just get rid of them really quickly. What I tend to do with this type of tool is try and try again. So you tend to be having your fingers on Ctrl-Alt-Z with your left hand as you do this, and I try to just get a flick of a line that's relatively quick that matches the other lines in a manner that I really like. So what you tend to do is get the line wrong, try again, go, try again, go, try again, until you really reach a point of the line where you're happy. And you'll probably notice if you watch lots of other artists do their thing, you'll see them kind of work out shapes, get it wrong, try again, try to get it wrong and again and again. And I'm not hating, because I do this a lot myself, but I do often wonder if this is the best way to be living your life. So using those sharp line tools, don't work too slowly, because it's going to pick up all of the little wobbles of your hand. Work as quick as you can and get those smooth, clean strokes. That's kind of how it's a bit more designed to be used, to kind of get things in, depending on how you like things. So flick it up, try to make our way around in a way that kind of satisfies that we've met the area. But if you don't like it, Ctrl-Z it straight away, just so that you're going to be reaching a point where you can work relatively quickly and try to kind of get things relatively smooth. So that's the way that I tend to really struggle with. What I like to do if I'm going to be painting things out is just a little bit different. So let's get rid of that. Let's go back to the first brush and keep it soft and just make it relatively small. I'm smiling again, I can't help myself. So what I tend to do here is use the soft brush tool. I might even slightly lower the opacity to maybe about 80% and use this in a number of small strokes to actually get the line that I want. Now, because we're working with the soft brush, this is a little bit more forgiving if you're doing lots and lots of small gestures like I am. I'm just slowly building my way around this circle, getting that kind of smoother line, just like so. Let's not worry about the actual shape, but a bit more about the ability to follow the guidelines that I've got underneath relatively accurately. And this is a little bit of a less stressful way to do things, I personally find. And also when you've got a few mistakes or bits that need cleaning up, because you do certainly still end up with a bit of a soft edge, what I tend to do is just flick over to the eraser tool and also keep that eraser tool on the soft brush. But as long as you keep that soft brush very small, you do essentially end up with the ability to make quite a firm edge on things. So working in a soft brush tool can be done quite a lot. Keep it very large if you're working very, very vaguely. And if you start to make it very small, as far as your kind of eye view situation is concerned, you actually end up with some relatively crisp line work. And again guys, really the only way to do it is just have a go. Get a feel for things, have a go at home. What works for me might not work for you, or you might discover something that I haven't heard of, in which case again, I want to hear all about it. So again, just going back to that soft brush, working my way around. And again, when it comes to curves and bits like that, I've talked about this before when it comes to pencil and paper, but your hand is going to work very well at drawing a curve that bends away from the hand, not very well at drawing a curve that bends towards your hand. I'm right-handed, so this curve here isn't amazing for me. So what I'm just going to go ahead and do is hold R and use that to rotate the canvas, let go of R, and I'm back to the pen tool automatically, just so that my hand is always working in a direction that best suits kind of the natural ergonomics of things. Sweep that line back round. Maybe I don't like this join here, maybe it's a bit too thick, so again, pop over to the eraser tool and just use that opportunity to start to clean things up. So the finished product might look like I've got really smooth line work, but that actually might be the result of working over a slightly longer period of time. And personally, the truth is that the only way to get nicer and cleaner lines is to work a little bit longer and put a bit more time into it. I wish there was this super quick answer that I could find out there, but for me personally, it really boils down to you're going to get better work out of a piece if you put in the time and possibly work a little bit more slowly, at first at least, before you start to build up to being a bit of a quicker artist. So guys, although very quick and basic, I really do hope you found that to be useful when it comes to the first things you might want to bear in mind when it comes to doing things on Photoshop. Just to recap, I like to work on an A3 sheet of paper because your artwork's always going to be better if it's nice and full of detail and you can just scale things down and make them smaller. That's always easier than working too small and trying to scale things up and realize all of that detail just simply isn't happening. Have a play around with the brush packs and links that I've got below, and of course this is really just a basic precursor to any more of the digital artwork tutorials that we're going to be doing in the future. I really wanted just to get this quick one out of the way and put it first in any playlist, just so that everybody is up to the same basic level. That means we can really crack on about some more colourful things when it comes to hair and skin tones and other techniques further down the line. And of course, a great big thank you to my delicious patrons on Patreon. Those are the guys that make all of this possible. So of course, an extra shout out to Namurator, Kiriyama, Epic Cara, Andrew E, Zenith6, Joshua H, Gabriel C, Breton F, Mateo E, Homongchi L, and Zahaki, among the many, many more whose names are scrolling fantastically across the screen as we speak. You guys are absolute heroes. I am, yes, still working on the rewards for last month's Patreon setup, so still got a little bit of catch up to do, but I am, thank God, well and happy to crack on. As for the rest of you, thank you so much for watching along. Get in the comment section if you've got anything to let me know, and give this video a like, and of course subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys for some more stuff in the future, so take care.